Hi, we move into chapter 19 today as we continue the interlocking themes that we've been exploring in 1 Samuel 18 and 19, as you can see on the right side of the screen, with the green being Saul's children for or with David, and today it'll be the focus on Jonathan, as you can see in that first green section there. And then also the blue are David's success and actions. In chapter 18, it was the focus on his success as a litany repeated throughout as a refrain, and now it's going to be more on his actions and fleeing as it moves into the battle between David and Saul that occupies several chapters that follow here. And the red is Saul's struggle to figure out what is going on here between his sons and Yahweh and himself and the people, given that he's been made king. And it's not as easy as Saul thought it would be. One of the themes that we're looking at here and that we've been looking at throughout is how the personal and the political are interwoven. When we looked at the beginning of chapter 18 and explored the question that many scholars are occupied with, the nature of Jonathan and David's relationship. How close are they, and is it physical in terms of their love for one another? And scholars looked at different verses, and some wanted to argue that the language of love there or other words in Hebrew were about personal relationships versus political relationships. But as I was saying at the time, they're not separable. The personal and the political are deeply connected, not only in this case because there are fathers and sons who are vying to be king, but throughout the Bible and all of life, really. Genesis is a book about small things in the sense of families and not gigantic battles like we see here with the Philistines. And yet Abraham and Sarah are expected to be the ancestors of nations, and they have to interact with the Egyptians and other things like that. So the personal and political are not separated, and they're not separated here either. And the question of sonship, which we've been seeing since the very first chapter of 1 Samuel, thanks to the work of Robert Polzin, and looking at the scene with Hannah and Elkanah and Peninnah at the very beginning, when the husband says to the barren wife Hannah, "Am I not worth more to you than 10 sons?" That was an overarching allegory about the value of the monarchy versus the value of Yahweh. Isn't Yahweh worth more than 10 kings? And so that theme will continue throughout. It should not surprise us that the question of whose father and whose son David and Jonathan are will play throughout. So as you can see on the chart now on the right side, the red things that are color-coded red are where people are seen as sons of Saul, whether that's Jonathan or David, and the purple is where they have an other father or mother. And again, that's either one, because we'll see in chapter 20 that Saul insults his son Jonathan by calling him the son of a perverse, rebellious woman, and he's chosen the son of Jesse. So we'll see how this plays out all the way through, really, the rest of the book of 1 Samuel. It won't be resolved until until Saul and Jonathan are both dead. And we've also been looking at the key words here, and as it continues in chapter 19, we have a new chart of keywords. In this first section here, you can see that this question we just look at, my father, my father, my father. Notice that Saul is only called king once, the king here, but overall, my father, my father. And the question of killing is in this first scene, because plainly the issue is Saul planning to kill David. As we go through the chapter, that theme will continue, and we'll look at some more keywords, including messengers, and how indirect the conversation is. You can see how many times messengers is mentioned there, along with the Hebrew word that's translated here, let go, for consistency, but could also be translated send in some places. So we note here, Saul sent messengers, but he said to me, let me go. And so I translated it consistently, so you can see how often that word of sending away or sending with a message is there. So let's keep our keyword element up here. And one reason I want to leave that is I've also provided some immediate translations that reveal some of the Hebrew use of bodies parts as expressions of things. So here, the hand of my father, and we'll see, and the face here, and we'll see others with ears and eyes as well. And the new RSV that I'm using on the left side of the screen, almost always for reasons I have no idea, covers over the visceral element of the Hebrew, relating relationships to how our bodies encounter each other, especially faces, ears, eyes. So we'll see that as we go. So as we ended the scene before, Saul had determined that David was his enemy. So the Philistines are his enemy outside and David's his enemy within. And that's a problem for a king, to have the person who'd been soothing you and who your son is best friends with be your enemy. But he's only his enemy because Saul has decided he's his enemy, because he was jealous of the women in the street singing that David had killed his tens of thousands and Saul, quote unquote, only his thousands, which, as we saw at the time, was a misunderstanding of the way Hebrew works, in having a two-line thing that is suggested as literally more that David killed that they're celebrating, rather than just a proverbial phrase like we might say thousands and millions. So Saul spoke with his son Jonathan and with all his servants about killing David, and immediately we have a bad translation from the new RSV. As you can see in my note pane down below, the King James has it much more directly, as many translations do. And Saul spake to Jonathan his son and to all the servants that they should kill David. It's not the topic of killing him, it's a command to kill him. And the New English Bible similarly. Then Saul told his son Jonathan, and all his servants to kill David. So whereas the new RSV translation on the left may make it seem like they're just having a conversation about the possibility and the pros and cons, what we can hear from the other translations, it's a specific plan, and he's telling them to do it. Not specifically the son, Jonathan, versus the servants, but all of them are out there to kill David. Notice he's already tried to get David killed by sending him out to the Philistines to get 100 foreskins for Michal, but that didn't work. So now he's trying to get his own son to be the agent of this killing. But of course, that's not what's going to happen. And we see the contrast is because Saul's son Jonathan took great delight in David. And the word for delight here, hafez, is ironically echoing his father in 1822, when Saul plainly was lying to say he took a great delight in David. But for Jonathan, as much as we can tell, it's sincere. At Bailey, trying to express the homoerotic elements of this, notes it could be translated, he desired David very much. And that's very possible as a translation without necessarily putting it in the categories of our modern world, like is this a gay relationship or are they quote unquote homosexual? Those categories don't belong in the ancient world simply because they didn't exist. So what that desire is can't be specified because the text just simply doesn't say whether it's a sexual desire or a philos in the sense of friendship desire. Or both. So we know, though, that the contrast is that Jonathan is greatly joined to David and wants to be closer to him, and Saul wants him dead. So Jonathan tells David, my father Saul is trying to kill you. Therefore, be on guard tomorrow morning, stay in a secret place and hide yourself. And as we'll see here in this scene, and as we look at it in chapter 20 that follows when we get there, Jonathan here is very clear on what his father's intention is. He's just heard it specifically. But in chapter 20, after this scene, when Saul says he will not kill David, somehow Jonathan begins to trust his father again to David's risk, but David isn't quite so trusting, as we'll see when we get to chapter 20. So right now it's very plain. My father Saul is trying to kill you, or literally seeking to kill you. And so therefore, Jonathan is now giving David instructions. And many scholars have wondered in this chapter and the next chapter, who exactly is leading whom here? Yes, Jonathan is leading immediately, but in many ways we'll see that David may be leading by indirection. And that's not obvious here because David actually doesn't say anything. It's only Jonathan speaking here. But we'll plant that seed and we'll see more of it later. As Falkman notes below, in terms of Jonathan telling David to be on guard tomorrow morning and stay in a secret place, he says, it's a warning that Saul's agents will have the same preference as all secret police when they want to run in a dissident without ado. The knock on the door will take place in the early morning hours. And so we see that here. And as Falkman again notes, only entering the night offers David a chance of recovering a future. And we'll see more about evening and morning in chapter 20 in the second round of this. So stay in a secret place and hide yourself. We're going to see that hide is a key word in chapter 20, but a different verb than we have here. So in a secret place. And yet in the very next verse, he says, I will go out and stand beside my father in the field where you are. So is there some inconsistency between saying go hide in a secret place as if Jonathan himself doesn't know it, but in the field where you are? We could try to harmonize that by saying a secret place in the field, but it doesn't say that. And there's been no reference to field so far. We'll see in chapter 20, there's great emphasis on the field, even echoing a little bit, but obviously, ironically, the Cain and Abel situation when they're told to go out into the field there. But obviously, the two brothers here, Jonathan and David, so to speak, are not out to kill each other. So he tells him, notice this is just Jonathan talking. We don't know anything about what David's thinking or feeling here. I will go out and stand beside my father, literally at the hand of my father, which will match Saul's hand holding the spear again for the second time in 19:9. And here is my note suggesting a fake solidarity between Jonathan and Saul, that he's standing alongside his father at his hand, like he's on his side. So Jonathan is plainly perfectly willing to lie to his father, much like his sister Michal will. Michal. And I'd like to show this chart as we enter the scene from Jonathan Jacobs, whose work we've looked at before. Here's a picture of him. This is from his chapter in this book on characterization in the books of Samuel, analogies between minor characters, the example of Michal. And this chart here, which I'll post on the website, notices the parallels between what we're seeing here in this scene in 19:1-7 between Jonathan and David, and what we'll see in the scene that follows between Michal and David in 19:11-17, when they're both aware of their father's plan to kill David, and they both warn David about it, and then they lie to their father about it, Jonathan through words and Michal through actions, and then in the end, Saul challenges each of them in one way or another. In our immediate scene, Saul takes Jonathan's word and promises not to kill David, at least for now. But in the Michal situation, he challenges Michal, and we'll look at that when we see that scene there. So both children are acting in a similar way, lying to their father to protect David. And we might want to ask why. The text doesn't say, but we already know that Jonathan had the experience in the honey incident back in chapter 14 of his father being perfectly willing to kill his own son to avoid the shame of violating an oath. And so Jonathan certainly knows that his father can be murderous even toward him. Michal knows that her father offered Merab, her older sister, as a wife and then took it away. So she certainly knows that whatever Saul may be setting up between her and David isn't to her father's benefit, even though we're told that Michal loves David just as Jonathan loves David, although we had not been told that about Merab. So both Jonathan and Michal have seen things that suggest that their father is not someone to be siding with, and yet here Jonathan pretends to side with his father, or at least is saying to David that's what he will do. This is just a plan at this point. And he says, "You'll speak to my father about you, and if I learn anything, I will tell you." Literally, and what I see, I will tell you. So again, the Hebrew being much more embodied in terms of sensory connections than the New RSV does. So here the scene unfolds. And Fackelman notes there's a little chiasm in this immediate scene. It isn't formed well in my little note pane there, and we don't need to look at it in detail, but it's to highlight that just the end of this part and into verse 5 has a nice little set of parallels here. So Jonathan spoke well, literally spoke good, tov, and we'll see later, it's not a key word in this passage immediately. It's not used very many times, but the question of who is good and whether David is good or not will be a key theme throughout this section, if not a key word immediately here. So Jonathan spoke well. So the narrator tells us in advance the general nature of his speaking, and then we hear specifically what he's saying to him. And he tells him a couple of things that's worth paying close attention to. The king should not sin against his servant David. And as my note below notes, it's rare that characters test one another theologically as here. We've not seen sin in a while, but there's an important memory of it that we'll bring up in just a moment here as we look at this scene that has a wonderful and terrible irony for Saul's sake. So Jonathan says, the king should not sin against his servant David for two reasons. Because he has not sinned against you, which raises a curious theological implication that if David had sinned against Saul, would Saul be justified in sinning back? If we define sin, as sin almost always is, the Hebrew chatat, meaning to miss the mark, as an archery term, and archery will take place in this chapter or in the next chapter, but that word won't be used about it. But hatat as an archery term is suggesting missing the mark in the sense of what God wants. And so God would never, by definition, want people to sin. So Jonathan's first justification for why his father, Saul, should not sin against David is a curious thing. But the second one makes a little more sense because his deeds have been of good service to you. Literally, his deeds have been very good toward you, quoting from Alter. Or from another version, his deeds have been to your good exceedingly. Which is to say he's defeated the Philistines and he soothed them with his music. But even if David hadn't done good deeds, still would Saul be justified in sinning against his servant David? Notice that Jonathan has changed the question from the immediate action, you should not kill your servant David, to you should not sin against him. If he had said kill, well, the Bible justifies killing in a number of ways, and certainly these books are not against killing. That's exactly what the women were celebrating, mass killing that that Saul was jealous of. And we don't know that they have a sense of a Torah. The Ten Commandments are almost certainly from a later time, and we don't see them referenced here. So we don't know anything about what legal, in the sense of Torah provisions, they would have about sinning or not sinning. But certainly there doesn't seem to be any sense that no matter what Jonathan says here, Saul should not be sinning against David, even though he might be justified in some context in killing David if he thought he was dangerous to Israel or one of a number of means. And the text, the broader text of Deuteronomistic history, doesn't tend to provide divine judgment against people killing rivals otherwise. There are only certain circumstances where divine judgment is called down upon people, and largely it's for the so-called sin of Jeroboam, which is, say, worshiping in the wrong place rather than killing people. But there's not much theological talk here. It's interesting that Jonathan turns it into a question of sinning rather than the immediate question of killing. So let's go scroll down to see the rest of our immediate passage here. He continues here, Jonathan continues, for he took his life in his hand, which is to say David. But curiously, this is not hand in the Hebrew. It's palm, which is a figure of speech used repeatedly in the Hebrew Bible. Another time, as you can see in 28:21 and 1 Samuel, it's a figure of speech of taking. We'd say take your life in your hand, and that's why the translation has it there. But the Hebrew has take your life in your palm. Much like the Psalm refrain that Yahweh holds people in the palm of Yahweh's hand. So your life is in the palm. And when he attacked the Philistine, which is obviously Goliath, and Yahweh brought about a great victory for all Israel. So notice how he's continuing the theological theme. Not only has David done things that redound to Saul's public benefit and his personal benefit in terms of being soothed from the evil spirit, but Yahweh is on his side and brought a great victory for Israel, which is, say, the very victory that kings were chosen, Saul in particular, chosen to do, to win their battles against the Philistines. So you saw it, as Jonathan continues, and rejoiced. Why then will you sin against an innocent person by killing David without cause? It's quite a long speech here. Let's look at a couple more details here. Literally, the phrase against an innocent person, badam naki, means by shedding innocent blood. And as Sumera notes below, or at least my note refers to him, the king's moral authority over death depends on it being exercised justly. And that's the point I was just trying to point at in terms of where killing could be justified, but sinning never could be. So here's where he brings those two ideas together. He would sin against an innocent person by killing David without cause. If he wasn't innocent and there was a cause, then it wouldn't be sin, Jonathan is saying. Notice this is not Yahweh's point of view or the writer's point of view. This is simply Jonathan's point of view. And why should we assume that Jonathan is a theologian or that his theology governs? But it's enough to get Saul to listen to him, again with an irony we'll see. The word for innocent here, naki, can also mean free as in exempt from an obligation, and we see it a couple of other times here. So it doesn't have to mean innocent in that sense. It could mean have other nuances. The phrase without cause here, hinam, will also be used in chapter 25 about Abigail and Nabal, and we'll see it there. But it also echoes into Psalm 69, and let's look at that verse just for a minute because it may be familiar to you from the New Testament Gospels. More in number than the hairs of my head are those who hate me without cause. Many are those who would destroy me, my enemies who accuse me falsely. Well, certainly, David is not being accused of anything here. Saul just wants to kill him because he's jealous. But to the extent that the New Testament conveys Jesus as a Davidic descendant and calls upon Psalm 69, one wonders whether one might even go back and echo this passage from 1 Samuel 19. So then Saul heeded or heard and obeyed the voice of Jonathan. And that's the great irony that brings back the passage from 15:22 to 24 when Samuel upbraided Saul. So let's go back and listen to that one. I'll put it on the screen so you can see it here. And Samuel said, has Yahweh his great delight, notice the word delight again there, in burnt offerings and sacrifices, as in obeying the voice of Yahweh. Surely to obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed than the fat of rams. For rebellion is no less a sin than divination, and stubbornness is like iniquity and idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of Yahweh, he has also rejected you from being king. Saul said to Samuel, I have sinned, for I have transgressed the command of Yahweh and your words, because I feared the people and obeyed their voice. And the irony is, Saul heeded the voice of Jonathan. Is this the voice of Yahweh, or is he again listening to the voice of the people? It doesn't say he's afraid, but the Jonathan is certainly one of the people, speaking like Samuel in a way, but he's not a prophet, and there's no particular reason for Saul to think that Yahweh is with Jonathan in his speech, and yet he listens to it and continues by swearing, which will evoke the swearing theme that we'll see in chapter 20 very soon. As Yahweh lives, he, of course, David, shall not be put to death. So now he's under oath saying he would not put him to death, and that will come up again in chapter 20. But as we'll see in a couple of verses, an evil spirit comes from Yahweh upon Saul, and it's all over, and he will try to kill him again. So we will continue we'll go one more verse here before we stop for today. So Jonathan called David and related all these things to him, or literally, and brought him all these words. And then he was back before, and David was back before Saul's face as before. So as you complete the scene, it's really like a reset. It seems like it would be a reset, that Jonathan has convinced his father Saul to not kill David, that it would be sinful for him to do it, and that would get him in even more trouble with Yahweh. And he hears and makes a vow, and yet Saul is not that stable, and it will all come apart immediately after this. We'll continue with that next time. See you then. Bye-bye.